The old man's knees had been bad since 1971, but he still got down on them every morning without complaint. That was the kind of thing the war had done to him. Not taken away his ability to kneel, but taken away his reason to think twice about pain. Pain was just weather. You watched it come in, you let it pass, you kept working. He lived alone on 11 acres of mostly nothing on the east side of the county road. The farmhouse needed paint. The barn leaned slightly south, as if it had spent too many decades trying to turn away from the wind. His truck was a 1974 Ford that had rust blooms along the wheel wells, like something trying to grow in the wrong direction. Neighbors had been saying for 3 years that the truck would never pass another inspection. It always did. The land itself was the real problem. The backfield, the one he'd been trying to coax into productivity since his wife passed 6 years ago, was clay. Not the kind of clay that a good season could loosen, the kind that baked into something close to brick in July, cracked open in long, jagged seams, and shrugged off rain like a tin roof. He'd tried turning it twice. The tiller had nearly shaken itself apart. The soil pH was so low that even the weeds looked discouraged. A county extension man had come out the spring before last and walked the field in his clean boots and said, politely but clearly, that some land just didn't want to grow. He'd handed over a pamphlet about cover crops and driven away. The pamphlet was still on the kitchen table, holding down a stack of seed catalogs. The old veteran had read it. He'd read most things twice. But he had his own ideas about what the field needed, and none of them were in the pamphlet. It started quietly, the way most things he did started. He'd noticed, years back, how the soil near his henhouse was different, darker, softer. The chickens had been living there long enough that the ground had changed its character. Part of that, he knew, was the manure. But part of it, the part that kept nagging at the back of his mind, was the shells. Broken eggshells that the hens pecked apart, ground into the soil by small clawed feet, working calcium slowly into ground that had never asked for anything before. He began asking around, not in any formal way, just mentioning, at the feed store, at the diner on Route 9, to the man who ran the small egg operation 2 miles north, that he'd take any cracked eggs or empty shells they might otherwise throw out. People thought it was an odd request. A few of them laughed, not meanly, just with the comfortable certainty of people who believed they understood what farming required. He drove home with the first bucket of shells rattling in the bed of the Ford. The late April sky stretched gray and low overhead. The field waited. It had been waiting a long time. He unloaded the bucket that evening, setting it just inside the barn door where the light still reached. The shells were a mix of things: brown ones from the eggman's Rhode Island Reds, pale white ones from a neighbor's Leghorns, a few speckled ones he couldn't place. Some were nearly whole, just cracked along one seam. Others were dust and fragments, barely worth calling shells at all. He sorted none of it. He'd learned long ago that you didn't always get to choose the condition of what you were given to work with. You worked with what came. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the tree line, he carried the bucket out to the field. The clay was hard underfoot, still holding the cold of the night before. It had that particular look of land that is given up, pale and sealed, the surface almost waxy where years of rain had washed the topsoil thin and left behind what the water didn't want. He'd seen land like this before, not farmland. other kinds of ground, compacted by weight, closed off, refusing to absorb anything new. He'd learned in those places that sealed ground could still open. It just needed something to work into the seams. He didn't throw the shells. He knelt. That part mattered to him, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Maybe it was the bad knee, which made kneeling a slow and deliberate act that he couldn't rush even if he'd wanted to. Or maybe it was something older than the knee, some understanding that you didn't scatter, help carelessly over ground. You were asking to change. He pressed the shells into the clay with the heel of his palm, working a small section at a time, crumbling the larger pieces against the soil's surface and grinding them in. The powder clung to his work gloves and to the cracks in his skin. It smelled faintly of something mineral and clean. His hens followed him. They always did when he was out in the field in the early hours. 4 of them, the bolder ones, picking their way across the hard ground behind him like small, skeptical investigators. They pecked at the shell fragments he pressed in, rearranging his work with quick, efficient strikes, and he let them. Their feet were doing something useful. He'd seen that already, near the hen house. Small, scratching feet could work material into soil the way hands never quite could. By mid-morning, he had covered perhaps a third of one corner section. Not impressive by any measure. A man passing the fence road that morning in a pickup had slowed to look, then driven on without stopping. He'd seen the expression, brief, puzzled, moving toward dismissal, and hadn't felt the need to call out or explain. Explanations came at the wrong end of things. They came after, when the ground either proved you right or proved you wrong, and no amount of talking in the meantime changed which way it would go. He straightened slowly, hands on his knees, and looked at the pale field ahead. There was so much of it still waiting. He went back to the feed store that afternoon for a bag of lime. Not much, just enough to test a small corner of the worst section, where the clay ran almost orange under the gray surface and nothing had ever seemed to want to root there. The man behind the counter, younger by 30 years and louder by nature, watched him loaded into the truck bed with the expression of someone watching a person do something pointless in slow motion. "You still working that east patch?" the man said. He said he was. "What are you putting on it now?" he told him. Lime, eggshell, chicken scratch. Some patience. There was a pause, then a short sound from the man behind the counter. Not quite a laugh, but the thing that lived just next to one. A breath that meant he'd heard enough to know what he thought. "You know they sell soil amendments for that," the man said. "Real ones. Out of bags with instructions." He nodded. He knew. He drove home without explaining anything further. That evening he sat on the porch steps while the light went low and orange behind the tree line. And he thought about soil the way he used to think about ground in other places. Not farmland, not anything that grew, just ground that had to be crossed or held or given back to someone. Ground was never simple. People who hadn't studied it thought it was passive, just a surface you walked over or dug into. But it wasn't passive. It was a system. It was the whole history of everything that had lived and died in it, pressed down into layers, and if you wanted it to receive something new, you had to understand what it had already been through. His field had been through a lot. The previous owner had pushed it hard for years, pulling crops without rotating, running drainage in the wrong direction, letting the pH swing until even the weeds gave up on certain sections. What looked like dead ground to a younger man was, to him, a record of bad decisions made in a hurry. The kind of decisions that happen when you need this year's yield more than you need next decade's soil. He understood that. He didn't judge it. He'd seen the same reasoning applied to harder things than farmland, and he knew it almost always came from fear rather than ignorance. But fear didn't fix soil. Patience did. Calcium did. Time did. He brought his hands together in his lap and looked at the work blisters forming along his right palm, the old ones reawakening. There was something almost satisfying in that, the body remembering what it was built for. His knees ached. His lower back had been telling him all day that it had opinions, but his hands felt right. In the morning, he would start on the second corner section. The hens would follow him again, probably. They seemed to have decided the east field was interesting now, which was more than the men at the feed store had managed to decide, and he found that quietly amusing. He stayed on the steps until it was too dark to see the field. He was up before the sun again. There was a habit in him, worn into the bone long before farming had anything to do with it, that made staying in bed past 4 o'clock feel like a kind of failure. He didn't fight it anymore. He put on his boots in the dark, made coffee on the old electric burner, and stood at the kitchen window holding the cup in both hands, while the sky went from black to the color of a bruise over the tree line. The second corner section was smaller than the first, but it was worse. The soil there had never been right, even in the years when the rest of the field had at least tried. His wife had told him once, years ago, that nothing grew in that corner because it sat in the shadow of itself, which was the kind of thing she said that he hadn't understood at the time, but had never quite been able to set down either. He mixed his morning bucket with particular care, a tin coffee can of eggshells, ground down the night before with the back of a mason jar until they were almost powder. A second measure of the coarser broken pieces he kept for the upper layer, the ones the hens would work with their feet. He had developed a rhythm now, powder underneath where the roots would eventually reach, fragments on the surface where the acid lived closest to the air. He had read about this in a county extension pamphlet from years back, the kind that came in the mail and usually got used to light the wood stove. He was grateful now that he'd read it first. The hens came out of the coop when he unlatched the gate, the way they always did, moving in their sideways, hurrying walk like small, important women with too many errands. They followed him to the east field without any coaxing. He had noticed that animals tended to follow people who moved with purpose and no excess noise, and he had tried to be that kind of person for most of his life, with varying success. A truck slowed on the road near the fence line around 7:30. He recognized it. Belonged to a man who ran the larger spread 2 miles east, a man who had opinions about everything and the confidence to share them without invitation. The window came down. The man said something about eggshells again, something with a laugh in it. The word foolish might have appeared. The veteran did not look up from his work. He pressed a measure of crushed shell into a furrow he'd made with his thumb, covered it, pressed another. He was aware of the truck sitting there, the way you are aware of a cloud passing over you. Present, temporary, ultimately not your business. The truck moved on. He kept working. The hens moved around him in their methodical way, pecking at the loosened soil, occasionally looking at him with that flat sideways consideration that chickens have, as if assessing whether he was still making sense. He thought he probably was. The soil would tell him eventually. The morning stretched itself out the way mornings do in late summer when the heat comes early and stays. By 8 o'clock, the light was already pressing hard against everything, flattening the shadows, making the clay look paler and more indifferent than it actually was. He worked in sections, moving along the field's edge first, because that was where the ground was driest and where the calcium was needed most urgently. He had figured this out not from a book, but from watching what grew naturally near his old fence posts, the small volunteers, the weedy pioneers, and noticing that they clustered around the base of the older wooden posts, where lime had been leaching into the soil for decades. Nature always left instructions. You just had to slow down enough to read them. He had brought 2 more buckets out from the barn that morning. He had also added something to the mixture, wood ash from the fire pit he'd cleaned out the week before. Ash raised the pH too, he knew that much, and it mixed with the crushed shells in a way that felt right, felt layered, the way good preparation always felt like it had more than one idea working at once. The Army had taught him that. Not just the Army. Life had confirmed it. Single solutions rarely held. The ground needed more than one reason to change its mind. The chicks had grown bolder over the past several days. They moved further from the coop now, spreading into the worked sections of the field with increasing confidence, scratching at the loosened surface with their quick feet, turning up whatever the shells and ash and patient labor had begun to shift below. He watched them and felt something he did not have a clean word for. Not quite pride, not quite peace, something that sat between those two things and had a longer duration than either of them. Around mid-morning, a woman stopped at the fence. She lived down the county road about half a mile and had, over the years, never caused him any particular trouble. She asked what he was working on. He told her, plain and simple, eggshells and ash, trying to sweeten the clay. She looked at the field for a moment without speaking, and he appreciated that. Then she said she had more shells than she knew what to do with if he ever needed them. He said he would remember that. She nodded and walked on. He turned the moment over in his mind as he worked. It was small. It cost nothing. But it had a different texture than the truck on the road that morning. A different weight than the laughter that had followed him for days. He did not read too much into it. One person's curiosity was not a verdict. He had learned not to confuse kindness from individuals with acceptance from the crowd. The crowd would come around in its own time, or it would not. And either way, the field required the same work. He pressed another measure of crushed shell into the cracked earth and moved on. The hens keeping quiet company, the morning holding steady above them all. The week turned without ceremony. He rose each morning at the same hour, before the light had fully committed to the sky, and walked the field in the gray quiet to check what the night had left behind. He was looking for signs, not miracles, just movement. A softening in the clay's surface, a change in color where water might be holding. The way a dry field breathes differently once something has begun to shift inside it. He had learned to read land the way some men read faces, by looking at what it was trying not to show. The shells were disappearing into the soil slowly, the way all amendments do. The ash he had worked in earlier in the week had already blended to a faint dusting below the surface crust, and the crushed shell fragments were following, some still visible as pale flecks catching the morning light, others already pulled down by moisture and the gentle disturbance of the hens as they worked. He did not rush this. Rushing was for men who did not understand that transformation happens underneath, invisible, before it ever becomes visible. He had waited longer for less. On Thursday, his neighbor from the feed store stopped by the fence again. Not the woman from before, a different one. An older man who had sold him supplies for years and who had, on more than one occasion, given him a fair price without being asked. The man leaned on the post and looked at the field for a while before saying anything. Then he asked, straightforward and without ridicule, whether the shells were making any difference yet. He said it was too early to tell. The man nodded slowly, the way someone nods when the answer matches what they already expected. He mentioned that he had heard about it from a few people in town. He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way you report weather, something in the air, moving through. He did not ask what they were saying. He had a reasonable idea, and asking would only make the words louder than they needed to be. Instead, he asked if the man had any cracked bags of wood ash he could not sell. The man said he might. He said he would set them aside. That afternoon, he loaded 2 such bags into the bed of the truck and drove them back out to the field. The hens met him at the gate the way they always did, briefly interested, then diverted by something in the grass. He appreciated their honesty. They wanted feed and sunlight and company, and they made no secret of it. There was a kind of instruction in that. He worked through the afternoon heat, opening the ash into the rows he had turned, working it through the clay by hand, and then with the old broad fork, feeling the resistance ease slightly in places where the calcium had begun its slow chemistry. The ground was still hard, still proud in its way. But there were places now, a few, small, scattered, where his hands found something that felt like the beginning of give. He noticed. He said nothing. He moved on to the next row. The next morning he rose before the light changed color. He had done this most of his life, waking in the dark not from habit alone, but from something older, something that had worked itself into the bones during years when the difference between early and late could matter in ways that had nothing to do with farming. Now it was just the quiet he appreciated, the house settling around him, the smell of coffee heating on the stove, the sound of nothing that needed answering yet. He pulled on his boots at the back door and walked out into the cool gray air. The field was still shadow, but he could see the rows where he had worked, the turned clay sitting in long, dark ridges, the ash and the shell meal slowly working their way into ground that had not been asked to give anything for a long time. He walked the rows slowly, not expecting much, just looking the way a man looks at something he has put his faith into and must check without letting impatience spoil the watching. He did not see green. He had not thought he would. It was too early for that. But he got down on one knee at the far end of the second row and pressed 2 fingers into the clay, and what he found there was different from a week ago. The surface still broke in plates, still showed that pale, tired color, but half an inch down there was something that felt closer to soil than to dried brick. He pressed a little deeper and brought a pinch up to his palm and looked at it in the early light. Darker. Not much, but enough to notice. He stayed there a moment, kneeling, the way a man stays when he knows he is not ready to stand up and leave yet. His bad knee ached the way it always did in the morning, the old injury that had never fully apologized for itself, but he did not hurry. He had learned long ago that some things required you to stay in the uncomfortable position a little longer than felt reasonable. By mid-morning, the neighbor from the east fence had come back, not to apologize, not to ask questions with any real curiosity, but to lean on the post the way he sometimes did, looking across the land with the expression of a man who had already decided what he was seeing. He said something about the ash making a mess of the color, and how real farmers did not work backward. He said it the way people say things when they want the words to land without having to throw them too hard. The old man listened. He kept working the rows with the broad fork, steady, rhythmic, not rushing to answer. When the neighbor finally ran out of commentary and the silence grew long enough to become its own response, the old man straightened and looked at him for just a moment. He said the color of good ground was dark, and it got that way by being given what it needed, not what was convenient. Then he turned back to the row. The neighbor left without another word. Not because he had been convinced, just because there was nothing left to say that would not have made him look smaller than he already did standing there. The old man watched him go the way you watch weather move off, without satisfaction, without resentment, just the quiet acknowledgement that it had passed. By late morning, the chicks had spread further across the worked ground than they had gone before. They moved in small groups, picking through the turned ash and the shell grit with the focused attention of creatures who do not waste motion. He had not directed them. He had learned early that if you prepared a place properly, the things that belonged there would find it. You did not have to convince them. You only had to make the ground worth coming to. He went to the barn and came back with a bucket of water, poured it slow at the edge of the worked section, and watched how it moved into the soil. 2 weeks earlier, water had pooled on the clay surface and sat there like a lid. Now it went in, not fast, but it went in. He poured again and watched again. It was the kind of evidence that did not announce itself. It would never make a headline in the county paper. But to a man who had spent a life reading the ground for signs of what it was becoming, rather than what it had been, it was louder than anything the neighbor had said. He refilled the bucket from the trough and brought it back twice more before he was satisfied. Then he went inside, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and stood at the window, eating a piece of bread while the afternoon light spread across the field. The section he had worked looked different from inside the house than it did up close. From here you could see the whole shape of it. The dark bands of worked earth against the harder pale clay at the edges, the ash still visible in places, the small movements of the chicks going about, their work without any knowledge of what they were part of. He had stood at enough windows in enough difficult years to know that the view from inside told you things the close-up work could not. You had to step back sometimes to understand what the ground was saying. He had tried to explain that once to a younger man at the feed store who had asked him why he never seemed panicked when things looked bad. He had said that panic came from only knowing how to see what was right in front of you. The younger man had nodded politely and changed the subject. He finished the bread and rinsed his hands again out of habit. Outside, the clouds were pulling in from the west, the slow, heavy kind that moved like they meant it. He had been watching that sky since morning. Rain was coming, and for the first time in a long while, the ground beneath those clouds was ready to receive it. The rain came in the night, He heard it first as a low-pressure shift, the kind that woke him before the sound ever reached the roof. A man learned to sleep that way when he had spent enough seasons with crops depending on weather. He lay still for a moment and listened to the first drops come down on the tin of the porch overhang, slow and separate, each one distinct, and then the rhythm building until it became a continuous sound, steady and unhurried, the kind of rain that meant to stay. He did not get up to check anything. There was nothing left to check. The ground was prepared. The shells were in it. The seedlings were already holding. Whatever the rain intended to do now, he had done his part first, and that was the whole of what a man could ever say for himself. He pulled the blanket up and let the sound of it carry him back to sleep. By morning, the field was dark with moisture. Every worked row soaked through. The pale clay at the edges turned a deeper color where the water had run in and spread. He stood at the fence in his boots and watched the light come across it. The seedlings had not washed out. They were still there, small and certain. The green of them brighter now against the wet earth, standing with the kind of hold that told you the roots had gone down deep enough to mean something. A week ago, he would not have believed the ground capable of holding anything that tight. Now the evidence was right in front of him, quiet and exact. One of his neighbors came by on the county road, slowed his truck, and looked out the window at the field without stopping. The man did not say anything. He just looked for a long moment, the truck idling low, and then he drove on. That was enough. He had not needed words from people when things were going badly, and he did not need them now that things were turning. The silence of a man who expected to see nothing, and instead saw something, was its own kind of statement. He walked the near row slowly, crouching once to press 2 fingers into the soil beside a seedling. The ground gave under his touch the way good soil was supposed to, with a slight resistance that told you it had structure now, that it was holding water without drowning, draining without going dry. Months ago, this same patch had repelled everything. Now it was behaving like land that wanted to work with you. The chicks moved around his boots without concern, picking through the wet surface, doing what they did. He straightened up and looked down the length of the field, the full run of it, and for the first time let himself think not about what it was, but about what it was becoming. There was a difference between those two things, and knowing which one to look at was what the whole season had been teaching him. He planted a short row of winter wheat that afternoon, not because the season was right for it, not because he expected a full harvest from it, but because the soil deserved to be asked again. He had spent months giving to it, and now he wanted to give it a question instead of an answer. He pressed the seeds in with his thumb, one by one, spaced the way his father had taught him and his father before that, and he covered them with the same quiet care he had used for everything else on this land since spring. The chicks followed him down the row. They were nearly hens now, their early fuzz long replaced by proper feathers, their legs stronger, their movements more deliberate. They had grown up on this field, and they knew its rhythms the way animals know a place they have never been made to fear. He watched one stop, tilt its head and pull something small from the loosened earth. Whatever it was, the thing was alive and moving, which meant the soil was alive and moving, which was the only proof he had ever needed. He finished the row before dark and went inside. That night he sat at the table where the old map had lived all spring and summer, but the map was folded away now. He did not need it anymore. He knew the field by feel. He poured a cup of coffee and held it with both hands, the way he had learned to hold things when his hands needed something to do besides shake. The window showed him the dark outline of the barn and, beyond it, the field disappearing into the evening. He could not see the seedlings, but he knew they were there. He thought about the man in the truck who had slowed down and driven on without stopping. He thought about all the men who had leaned on the fence through the summer, saying the things they said, and he held no particular feeling against any of them. They had not known what he knew. They had looked at cracked clay and old shells and a stubborn old man and seen only the surface of the thing. That was not cruelty. That was just the limit of what people can see when they have never been taught to look for what is not yet there. He had been taught. He had learned it the hard way, in places and conditions he did not name aloud anymore. And what he had carried home from that learning was this: the broken thing is not done. The exhausted ground is not done. The season that looks finished is not finished. You stay with it. You press your hands into it. You give it what it needs, even when it gives you nothing back. Because the giving back comes later, and later is still yours if you wait for it. He finished the coffee and turned off the light. Outside, under quiet dark, the field held its seeds and waited with him.